It's not a 24-hour day. We see a pattern, and we'll go through some of these scriptures, but there's a pattern. You might want to turn your Bible over to Joel, because we'll go through some of that. But there's a pattern of, first there's wrath, and then there's blessings. Okay, that's the pattern of the day of the Lord. First there's wrath, and then there's blessings. So let's turn to Joel, and we'll see that. Again, one of the main themes of the book of Joel is 3 chapters. The day of the Lord is mentioned 5 times. Okay. Verse 9 in chapter 3. Proclaim this among the nations, or the Gentiles. Prepare a war. Rouse the mighty men. Let all the soldiers draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords. Different than you see later on. And your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am the mighty man. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. Bring down, O Lord, your mighty ones. Let the nations be aroused, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth tremble. But the Lord is a refuge for his people and a stronghold to the sons of Israel. So what do we see here? Preparation for war, battle, right? Between the nations. God's calling the nations to come. And then in verse 17, then you will know I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. So Jerusalem will be holy, and strangers will pass through it no more. And in that day the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah will flow with water. And a spring will go out from the house of the Lord to the water of the valley of Shittim. Egypt will become a waste, and Edom will become a desolate wilderness, because of the violence done to the sons of Judah, in whose land they have shed innocent blood. But Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem for all generations. And I will avenge their blood, which I have not avenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So what do we see here? The Lord's blessing now the nation of Israel. Okay? So we see wrath and blessing. Now, we also see that in Zechariah. We'll kind of skip over that one. Let's go back to Joel chapter 2. Verses 1 and 2. And then we're going to take a little rabbit trail down. We'll look at Acts 2. We'll take a little rabbit trail down how Acts 2 uses Joel. But verse 1. Blow a trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Surely it is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. As the dawn is spread over the mountains, so there is a great and mighty people. There has never been anything like it, nor will there be anything like it after it, to the years of many generations. So what do we see here happening? There's a preparation for battle here. Okay. Then let's bounce to the end of the chapter. It will come about after this that I will pour out my spirit on all mankind, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. Even on the male and the female servants I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So what do we see here? We see God pouring out blessing. He's going to pour His Spirit out on inhabitants of the earth. Now, what's the context here? When is this going to happen? In the day of the Lord, right? Okay, so now the question then becomes, let's flip over to Acts chapter 2. What is Peter doing? Starting in verse 15, let's start in verse 14. Actually, let's go back. Well, you see in the beginning of the chapter, they're all starting to speak in tongues, right? And they're asking, well, how can this be? And in verse 13, some of them mocking them, saying they're full of sweet wine, that they're drunk. So, and Peter says, no, that's not the case. What does he say? But Peter, taking his stand with the 11, raised his voice and declared to them, Men of Judah and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and give heed to my words. So he's going to tell them what's happening here. For these men are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only the third hour of the day. But this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. And it shall be in the last days, God says, that I will pour forth of my Spirit on all mankind, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your young men will see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams, even on my bondslaves, both men and women. And I will in those days pour forth of my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will grant wonders in the sky above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and the vapor of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come. And it shall be that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So what is he quoting from here? Joel. Now what's the context of Joel? Is this the day of the Lord? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Who says yes?
Not next to.
Okay. Who says this is the Pentecost is the day of the Lord? No. It's Pentecost. All right. So, how the issue here, and this is a huge issue. We probably could spend two weeks on this issue, and I'm going to be very simple about it. I'm going to give you one perspective. I'm not going to defend it. If somebody's interested, I can actually. There's some papers that have been written on this. I can send you copies of them. But really the question is, how does the New Testament quote the Old Testament? And this is a huge debate. And again, if you're going to take the scriptures literally, we got to say, okay, well, how can the New Testament be applying this to, Pentecost when it doesn't look like that's exactly what's happening? In the time the New Testament was written, the Jewish sages, the rabbis, would look at Old Testament prophecy, and they really had like 4 different ways of interpreting and I'm not going to go through all of this here. We'll look at that. And the New Testament seems to take the same pattern of that, especially in the Gospels, especially Matthew, which was really written to a Jewish audience. They're all literal prophecies, and let me say this. That the prophecies in the Old Testament were always going to be fulfilled literally. The question is, when they quote it, were they quoting it as a literal fulfillment of that prophecy, or were they quoting it in a different way? And we kind of do that here. You think about it. We take a situation in the Bible and we apply it to our lives. We're not saying that we're fulfilling the Bible, right? What we're saying is, hey, this has application to us, and that's kind of a simple way. And we'll go through these 4 ways and then we'll kind of hone in on what I think is happening here. And there's, even within, conservative circles, there's a lot of debate on this, and somebody could disagree and say, no, it's a different, there's some other techniques I didn't mention here that the rabbis used, that they could have been using. But I think this probably is the simplest. There's 4 ways the rabbis would quote the Old Testament scripture. There's the Peshat, which is plain, literal meaning. So there's a literal prophecy, and we're seeing a literal fulfillment of it in the New Testament. Then you have Remez, which is a literal prophecy, but it's a type. Okay, and we'll see. We'll touch on all these scriptures. Then there's the Drash, which is an expansion of meaning, and usually is an expansion through a point of commonality. And we'll see that. And I think this is really what Peter's doing. We'll see that. And then there's what they call Sod, or the secret meaning. And that's where it's kind of there's no one prophecy that kind of summarizes that. I mean, there's not one prophecy that says it, but if you take a bunch of prophecies together, it's kind of what we have is summarized. And again, it's good to see some examples of that. And so you say, okay, that's what he means by that. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 2. And I think Matthew has the most of these because it was written to a Jewish audience. So he's using literary devices that a Jewish audience would be familiar with. If you go into the epistles, you don't necessarily see it as much because they're written more to the Gentile churches, and they're not as familiar with some of these literary devices. But let's turn to chapter 2, verse 5. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judah, for this is what has been written by the prophet." And this is quoting Micah 5:2. "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Okay? So Micah made a prophecy, Micah 5:2, and Jesus is the literal fulfillment. It's being literally fulfilled in the New Testament. Okay? That's the key. It's a literal prophecy being literally fulfilled. Now, let's move on to verse 15. This is talking about when they went down to Egypt. "He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son." Now, was that ever a prophecy spoken of Jesus? No. But Matthew uses it as kind of like a type. So Israel, who was called out of Egypt, was seen as a type of the Messiah. So he's not fulfilling it. It's a literal prophecy, but Jesus is fulfilling it as a type. He's using it as saying, okay, that's a type. Israel was a type of Christ in a sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, let's go to verses 17 and 18. And we'll spend more time on this one because this is the one I think that Peter's using. "Then what has been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled." Again, we're going to see that this is not referring to Jesus. We'll go back to the original context. "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more." So this was talking about children back in Jeremiah's day, but it's being applied to the women and children in Bethlehem when Herod was killing the children. Does that make sense? So they took a prophecy. They take a prophecy of the Old Testament and they kind of apply it give it a New Testament application. Okay, it's not the literal fulfillment of that prophecy, but it's the application of a literal prophecy. Does that make sense? And the last one, Matthew, and we're going to go back to that in a moment. Matthew chapter 2, verse 23. And I remember years ago, a young teenager, I was leading a youth group, and a young teenager came to me and she said, "I bet you can't find where this prophecy is in the Old Testament." And I said, "Okay, let me see." And she went right here. And she said, they came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, show me anywhere where that's a prophecy in the Old Testament. It's not. But it's a compilation of different verses